Alfred, or Al Smith, is a largely forgotten figure in American political history. A member of the Democratic Party, he never quite rose to the same heights as some of the other prominent members of his party. Woodrow Wilson, as much as it pains me to admit, seriously, I hate the guy, and Franklin Roosevelt are just two of the names that achieved much more than Al was ever able to. However, Al Smith does own an important place in history. Smith was the first Catholic to be nominated to be president by a major party. With his nomination, Smith broke more than a century of political tradition, and he would pave the way for those that would come after him. This is the first part of a series where we examine the 4 Catholics who have been nominated to serve as president of the United States. However, before we can discuss individual Catholics and their drive towards the presidency, we should first examine the general state of Catholics in the U.S. at the start of the 20th century, and how the country as a whole thought of the group. This will be a fairly quick and dirty explanation on the history of Catholics in the U.S. In the future, a full-scale video discussing the history of Catholics in the U.S. may be on the cards, however, this is not it. I'm just looking to provide a bit of background that will help us understand the feelings that were prevalent at the time of Al Smith's run. Catholics have lived in the United States since its founding. Under English rule, Maryland served as the home for most Catholics in the United States. In fact, the colony had been founded by George Calvert, the first Baron Baltimore, for the purpose of creating a sort of Catholic safe haven in the English colonies. However, Maryland was not the only colony to have Catholics. Each of the New England colonies had at least some sort of Catholic population, and Catholic communities would dot the South as well. But it was really only in Maryland that Catholics found safety and acceptance. The old animosity between Protestant and Catholic churches were still quite prevalent, even in a place as far away from Europe as America. Many Protestants viewed Catholics as subservient to the Pope and anti-English. These attitudes were the basis and beginnings for the extremely prevalent anti-Catholic attitude that would eventually come to check Al Smith's ambitions. By the time of the American Revolution, Catholics made up roughly 1.2% of the population. That is about 35,000 people. Catholics as a whole were actually much more likely to support the revolution. The ties between England and the Catholic Church were essentially non-existent, and while many Protestants struggled to square the revolution in their faith, Catholics had no such issue. Many notable members of the Continental Army were Catholic, including John Fitzgerald, who was General George Washington's secretary and aide-de-camp, while John Barry, another Catholic, would go on to help found the United States Navy. Stephen Moylan would become Washington's Muster General, and Daniel Carroll and Thomas Fitzsimmons would both be elected to Congress. This did help to improve attitudes towards Catholics throughout the colonies, and many states would pass acts and laws that would help prevent outright discrimination against Catholics. However, it should be noted that this didn't mean that Catholic discrimination suddenly disappeared. Far from it. In fact, states like North Carolina would have oaths in place to ensure that a person was Protestant until the middle of the 19th century. These oaths would bar all Catholics from serving in public offices. In most places, Catholics found themselves not outright rejected, but also not quite accepted with open arms. This ambiguity towards Catholics would continue until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Catholic population in the United States would suddenly balloon massively. In the late 19th and early 20th century, millions of Catholics would pour into the country. Many of these Catholics came from Ireland and Germany. As so often happens in American history, this new immigrant population was viewed with quite a bit of suspicion and mistrust. Many people believed that the new Catholics, especially those from Ireland, were completely and utterly loyal to the Pope back in Europe. This loyalty meant that they could never really be American, nor could they really support American democracy. In response to this belief, we see the rise of nativism movements, the most popular being the Know Nothing Party, and a widespread adoption of discriminatory beliefs, laws, and ordinances. By the early 20th century, much of the country viewed Catholics with suspicion. Catholics were thought to be incapable of being true Americans, and incapable of participating in the political system. They were seen as completely and utterly loyal to the Pope, and the few Catholics who did manage to find some sort of position in politics were thought of as papal agents who operated with the goal of subjugating the United States under the control of the Pope in Rome. It was into this system of discrimination and belief that a man named Alfred Smith would be born. Alfred Emanuel Smith was born in 1873 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. His mother, Catherine, was the daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants, while his father, Joseph, was the son of Italian and German immigrants. Alfred and his family struggled heavily. At 13, his father died, and Al was forced to leave school in order to support his family. he would never attend college or high school. Instead, Smith turned towards his faith and his acting career to further his life. Smith, even at a young age, was a gifted orator, and his work on the New York theater circuit would only improve his skill. Al's first job in the political arena would be as an investigator in the Commissioner of Jurors' office. It was here that Smith would first interact with Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was perhaps the most famous political machine in the United States. It operated as the center of the Democratic Party in New York, and in many ways completely controlled the government of New York City. The leader, or boss of Tammany Hall, Charles Francis Murphy, quickly identified Smith's incredible ability as a public speaker, and the machine worked hard to improve his political standing. Smith would go on to serve in the New York State Assembly, where he would become a champion of immigrants, the working class, and factory workers. Smith would also serve as sheriff of New York County, and then as governor from 1919 to 1920, and then again from 1923 to 1928. During this time, Smith became a leader of the progressive movement in the state, and would gain a reputation as the people's champion. In 1924, Smith would unsuccessfully run for the Democratic nomination for president. Smith represented the more progressive and urban side of the Democratic Party, while his opponent, William Gibbs McAdoo, represented the more traditional conservative base of the party. This loss did not deter Smith, and he pledged to run again for the nomination in 1928. Before Smith could get on the ballot in 1928, he first needed to secure his party's nomination. This was a tall task. After all, he'd already suffered a defeat in 1924. Smith faced two major issues in securing his nomination. The first was his association with the Tammany political machine. Even at the height of its power, most people in the United States could see that the political machine subverted American democracy, and that subversion proved unpopular among those outside of its influence. Smith was able to effectively combat this association by pointing towards his record as governor and his support for efforts to clean up corruption in the state's government. However, the issue of the machine paled in comparison to Smith's faith. As already mentioned, even in the North, Catholics were not viewed in a very positive light, or they were at least viewed with enough suspicion to keep them from attaining high office. In the South, it was even worse. At the time, the Democratic Party still relied heavily on the very discriminatory white population in the South. Many folks throughout the South viewed Catholicism as a sort of degenerate type of Christianity that would destroy the values of American Protestant society. And as much as Americans want to proclaim their Americanness, many Protestants were still affected by the traditional animosity between Catholicism and Protestantism. Remember, at this time, the Democratic Party still counted men like Hiram Wesley Evans, a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, among its members. In fact, Evans was actually very vocal in warning the establishment of the Democratic Party that if they nominated Smith, they would lose the support of the KKK and the South. This belief was common throughout the very powerful Southern wing of the party. Smith would never have made it across the nomination line without the help of one man. That man was arguably the greatest political figure in the history of America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was, at least on paper, an ardent Protestant. This provided Smith the most powerful and important lifeline of his campaign. Roosevelt provided a perfect example for Smith and his supporters to point to and say, well, if that Protestant can support Smith, why can't you? Another factor that pushed Smith over the line was the fact that many who had the political clout or ability to run against him were unwilling to do so. It's hard to say exactly why many who could have run against him didn't, but there are really two main aspects that likely push people away from running. The first is the simple fact that Smith had secured the support of Roosevelt. Roosevelt himself had already started gathering the political power he would eventually become famous for, and his name alone carried quite a bit of weight among the general public. After all, Teddy Roosevelt was still extremely popular, and who can really tell a difference between the two? Oh, well, yeah, maybe that's kind of easy. The second issue at hand was the relative prosperity in the country. America was still riding high from the aftermath of the Great War, and its GDP was just climbing and climbing. The unemployment rate was down to 4.5%, and all across the country, families were seeing their wealth climb and climb while their prices stayed stable. I'm sure nothing is about to happen that could possibly change that. What? What's that? A Great Depression? In this economy? No shot. Anyway, the point is that the prospect of facing off against the party that was presiding over a period of excellent economic growth was not very attractive, And so, with his possible adversaries giving up in droves and the backing of a very powerful player, Smith was finally able to secure the Democratic nomination. However, the hard work had really just begun. Meanwhile, on the other side, Republicans had chosen Herbert Hoover to run on their ticket. Hoover was actually a beloved figure at the time. He'd done quite a lot of charity work throughout the world, and had served in the past 3 administrations. Today, he's really only viewed in a negative light because of his abysmal failure in leading the country through the Great Depression. In any case, the die was now cast. It was Alfred Smith and the Democratic Party on one side, and Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party on the other. Smith faced 2 main issues in the campaign. The first was the more physical issues, and that was the excellent state of the economy. As James Carville would eventually say in the 1990s, it's the economy, stupid. And in this case, that economy just so happened to be in great shape, and the incumbent president, President Coolidge, belonged to the Republican Party. This meant that Hoover was the recipient of the good feelings and support that comes from a strong economy. There really wasn't much Smith could do about this. Yes, he could make promises and try to convince voters that his economic policies would either continue or improve the current economic situation, but the truth is that the choice was between the candidate that came from the party that had presided over the past decade of economic growth, or the candidate of the party who hadn't seen the White House since the Great War. I mean, after all, there's no possible way that this economy could do anything but soar under Republican leadership. Oh, what's that? The economy crashes just a year later. Are you sure? Well, anyway, Smith couldn't win on the economic issues, but that's really only one aspect of a presidential election. This is where the larger problem comes into play: Smith's religion. While this wasn't necessarily a problem in the heavily Catholic Northeast, it certainly was in the rest of the country. Prominent members of society, from ministers to political leaders and from the average person to the leader of the KKK, the public and political class were seemingly lockstep in the fact that they simply did not trust a Catholic in power. Their traditional attacks came at Smith from all sides: the question of him selling the country out to the Pope, to him destroying American moral and societal values. Some people even suggested that the United States should ban Catholics from holding public office altogether. The discriminatory feelings towards Catholics were deeply entrenched in America, and Al Smith didn't quite know how to handle it. Despite the numerous efforts of those around him, Smith was unwilling to engage on the issue of his faith. While some issues, like that of Smith giving the country over to the Pope, were seemingly too exaggerated and insane to even engage with, others, like the question of his morals and values, were issues that Smith could have easily tackled. As we will see later in this series, other Catholics were able to tackle the issue of their faith effectively. Smith, on the other hand, just couldn't find a way he was comfortable with to tackle the issue. In fact, Smith seemed confused as to why it was an issue. Wasn't this a political competition, not a moral competition? This was truly born out of the way Smith's political career had developed. He'd only run for office in one state, New York. New York had a much larger Catholic population, and their non-Catholic population was not nearly as anti-Catholic as their southern counterparts. I think the real issue for Smith was that he viewed this election in a similar way to how he viewed his elections in New York. He was running for office, and those who would elect him were reasonable and non-prejudiced people. In hindsight, Smith was naive, and while we can't say for certain, I believe him tackling the issue of his faith head-on would have at least helped him stem the bleeding, and would have made the election much closer. In the end, Smith's presidential election was tied to the feelings towards Catholics, and Smith could not find a way to overcome them. So why then was Smith's run important? Well, first of all, it did break a barrier that Catholics had faced throughout the history of America. Smith, as already stated, was the first Catholic to be nominated by a major party, and his nomination opened the door for others to potentially run. And secondly, Smith's run really signaled the changes coming in the coalitions of the 2 major parties. While Smith was quite far off from winning, losing the Electoral College 444 to 87, and the popular vote by over 6 million votes, he did do very well in certain areas throughout the country. Smith had major gains in urban and suburban areas. Places like Chicago and New York City voted heavily for Smith, and Smith actually won the majority of the votes in the 12 largest cities in the country. This seems like a no-brainer when viewing this election with our modern outlook. After all, today Democrats win large cities by double-digit percentages. But we must remember that in 1924, the Republicans won those cities by 1.6 million votes. 4 years later, Smith was winning them. Smith also did much better among the large immigrant populations in the country. It's unsurprising that he did well among the Irish and Germans, but Smith also did well among the Polish, Italians, and ethnic Jews. Smith's coalition was really a fledgling start to the coalition that would deliver the presidency to Roosevelt and the Democratic presidents after him. Smith started the change that would take the Democrats and turn them into the party of FDR and JFK instead of the party of Hiram Evans and Andrew Johnson. Al Smith is a figure in American politics that many forget. After all, he was never quite able to gain the national level office that he so often sought. But Smith really laid the groundwork for the coalition that would elect FDR and even JFK. His presidential runs broke through the barrier that had stopped so many Catholics from obtaining public office, and would allow the Catholics we would talk about later in this series the opportunity to even be taken seriously as a candidate. Smith deserves to be remembered not as a loser or a failed politician, but instead as a trailblazer and a founder of the modern Democratic Party. Thank you for listening to this episode of Idiot Talks History. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. As always, be sure to leave me a comment with any suggestions or notes, and be sure to call me out down there if I was wrong about something. Peace.